Hi, my name's Colter. This is my dissertation project. These lovely people make it. And I just, mooch off Steve a lot. No, but basically, the basics of this game, and what we're going to talk about today, is the design of an educational game that's not just used for like learning about different learning theories, but also is actually used to assess them. So, how do you assess learning theory in a meaningful way outside of, just hey, let's name this learning theory. Let's talk about who's the researchers that founded it. But how do you actually use learning theory in the real world context, right? Different people all view and understand the world in very different kinds of ways. So how can we, in a more situated and realistic way, actually start seeing that? How can we start having people sense and understand how people talk about and think about the world in these different and disparate ways? Um, that's this game. So I'm the game director for it. I oversee the Josh, welcome back. These all lovely people and a couple others in actually going through and them assembling and making the game. I'm also one of the co-writers for the game. I've written a lot of the narrative with Dr. Slota, and together we've then given them the wings to actually make it a real thing. If you'd like to introduce yourself. Sure.
Hi, I'm Josh Hirshfield. I'm actually know a few familiar faces. I think we've spoken a little bit already. I just walked in.
He's doing an overview about what it is.
Okay, yeah. So my role in the project is to basically be aware of everything that's happening and just sort of as sort of a managerial and direction-ish thing based on what Colter and Steve need to do. I communicate those needs to the team and say, okay, here's what we have to do, here's how we can do it, and then based off of what everyone else says, they say, yeah, that's good, and back and forth, and in many ways, I think you once called me the great communicator.
Yeah, basically. So you translate our understanding of the learning theory and the educational stuff into an actually made and assembled game.
Yeah. So I also did the music, so I did the composing for that, and then of course I'm also just helping out wherever there is need for programming or design work. So I'm going to pass it to the master of dialogue.
Devin, I'm the master of dialogue. I also I make bugs and then fix them. I don't know after the game, the dialogue system. So yeah, general code monkey. Thanks to Josh for insulating me. Physically and
Hi, I'm Mackenzie Fox. I've had a short history since graduation and during my time at UConn of working on a couple serious games or edutainment or whatever terrible term that we should not call it. And just like that, I'm fired.
He makes that.
So I work on the art for EOS. I've done all of the character art and design, and I've done assets in the environment and placement of those assets in the environment, as well as UI design.
Hi, I'm Zachary Anderson. I'm not a I almost said educator. I'm not an educator or a game designer. I'm just a comp sci student, and my job is to fix bugs and to yell at Colter when he says things that I don't agree with.
You can tell we have a very bad relationship between us. Yeah.
I think most of you recognize my mask at this point. My job on this is interesting. It's the first time I've ever been the producer of a game as opposed to managing the process. Because I worked in instructional design before I became a professor of games and play, I had a lot of experience navigating needs analyses and doing the basic legwork of design and development. And so that's what I was most comfortable with. This is the first time I've taken on the role of finding money and getting people through HR and all of the other things that come with being sort of the administrative portion of the team. But in addition to that, I've worked really closely with Colter on developing the dialogue because one of the purposes of this game, and it is not the purpose of this game, is to teach pre and in-service educators. And because we're leaning into learning theory and philosophies of education and the values that teachers espouse, it was actually really important for me to have a hands-on role to ensure that the learning objectives we're baking into this were reflected in such a way that they represented the things teachers actually have to do. And we'll talk more about this in a moment, but the game itself is centered on the ISTE standards for educators. There are 3 sets of standards. There's standards for students, standards for educators, standards for technology coaches, and the educational technology program at UConn, which that's what this slide is about, the 2 summers program, is centered on the ISTE standards for technology coaches. And EOS-503 is divided into 2 portions that Colter will be able to tell you more about, but the portion we're sharing with you today is the one that's centered on the standards for educators, whereas the second portion of the game that's currently in development is focused on the standards for technology coaches. And that's intentional to make sure that we create a up close and personal view of what teachers do with technology in classrooms, as well as the 40,000-foot view of what do you do if you're the tech coach who's in the administrator's office downtown and you're responsible for navigating the relationships between teachers, parents, community members, other administrators, students, etc. So I've kind of taken on this dual perspective of being part instructional designer on this project and part administrative authority figure to try and corral the cats that I am dealing with. They're all cool cats, so it was fine. And basically, to help bring this to fruition, it essentially was a brainchild of mine 10 years ago when I was doing my dissertation through graduate school. I developed a text-based role-playing game for teaching teachers. And it turns out there are a lot of strengths to text-based role-playing, but one of them is definitely not the fact that it's easy for teachers to do if they have no background in games, because they don't want to let their guard down and expose themselves to ridicule or embarrassment or whatever by role-playing. And part of it also was the fact that they weren't constrained enough. So for people who had never played role-playing games before, they didn't really understand the boundaries of how to behave in those spaces. And I started to think through what is the best way to accomplish this 1-to-1 ratio between game objective and learning objective that we care a lot about, while also ensuring that the teachers can't just go and invent a race car and drive to Starbucks and do whatever they want in the role-playing game, because even though those are things you might expect a middle schooler or a high schooler to do, it was pretty common among our graduate students to just say, oh, well, I'm on the space station, I want to go to space Starbucks and get a coffee. And it's like, well, that's not what your prompt is. Like, there's actually a goal associated with gameplay. So we essentially had to figure out what is the appropriate level of engagement and in what context. So as we migrated through the last 10 years, this has transformed in a bunch of different ways, and it ended up in this iteration, which has been in development now for about 2 or 2.5 years, thanks to the exceptionally talented people in front of you who, if not for them, this would not exist. That I had depended on them. They are exemplars of what good digital media education can do. And I look at this project as being sort of the fruition of a lot of the things that I've written about and published about in the past, where, teachers can make games, game design students can make games. Let's get them to do these things together and not just produce something that is Carmen Sandiego or Oregon Trail or Math Blaster, but instead really try to emphasize the roles that people take on in these spaces. So with that, I'm going to hand this back to Colter, and I'll manage the slides from here. And if there are other questions, I can answer as we go. But I really do want to let them talk about their experiences with this project.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and again, thank you so much for helping make this be a reality of a thing with funding, so we can actually hire everybody at rates that are hopefully at least sufficient, but more so. Because one thing, and I'll actually kind of start with that, is that one thing. Before we get into some of the games, is when thinking about designing games, especially with originally everybody here was an undergraduate student with us, is making sure that you are compensating people appropriately for it. Because one of the challenges potentially is saying, hey, all the undergrads, would you like some experience? Would you like some exposure? People also need money to be able to live and work. And so making sure that you have funding sources to actually be able to allocate funds appropriately so that they'll not only give time and attention, but actually have the stability to focus on production is incredibly important. So some of the really pillars of our design, when we were thinking about designing this game, is how do we think about the alignment right? We've talked about how different media can have these different goals, right? What do you use a book for? What do you use a game for? How do you use them in these different kinds of contexts and ways to try and achieve different goals? So in the case of this game, we decided that learning theory and trying to incorporate and use educational technology in some meaningful way, yeah, you could do case studies, you could have them read about it, but having people experience in richly authentic environments where there's strong alignment between the actual gameplay objectives and the ways that we would want them to act in a real world setting is incredibly important. So in our case, we wanted the decisions they would be making. EOS-503 is a very decision heavy game. You're going to be making a lot of decisions and giving a lot of guidance and advice to people on how you think they should engage with complex situations. We wanted those decisions to be incredibly heavily aligned with the learning objectives around using learning theory about incorporating technology in meaningful ways, rather than, oh hey, our school has a new whiteboard. You should be able to use all the new smartboard features that come with it, right? But how do you actually use those in meaningful ways to actually help through the game?
I think one thing to kind of,
Oh, of course.
just one quick note about that. What Colter's describing is intended to reduce the barriers to transfer. And that's one of the biggest problems that educators face, is getting students to understand why the thing they're doing in the classroom actually matters somewhere. So if I go to my biology class and I learn that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, that does not help me. Like that, I don't know what to do with that information. It just exists as an inert fact in the world. And so it's not to say that transfer can't happen. It's very hard to measure. It's very hard to induce. And so when we're thinking about design, we're talking about goal adoption and how do you tune people's perception to the things that you want them to identify in real world situations, such that if I play this game, ideally, in an ideal circumstance, if I play this game, I might go back to my school and have a conversation with one of my colleagues or a parent or an administrator and get them to change their mind based on persuasion that is rooted in my read or perception of their understanding of how the world works. So the learning theories that are embedded in this are not so esoteric that anyone anywhere couldn't participate in this game. We actually tried to base all of the language in the game on learning theory without ever explicitly saying, I'm a behaviorist, and I believe that if you give people tickets, they're going to do such and such. It actually is intended to be much more subtle than that, so that the decisions that you're making regarding what comments do you give different kinds of people in that environment, you want to be able to read those people and figure out what do they believe and how are you going to convince them to change direction or take an action that matches their particular worldview. And that's really important in a world where civil discourse is decaying, right? That you actually want people to be able to engage in small d democratic kinds of participation. And the better way to do that than playing an FPS game where you're, going after Nazi zombies or whatever, is to actually have people engage in civil discourse and model what that can or should look like. And one of the other reasons that we talk about this one-to-one alignment of game and learning objectives is because not only do we want people to transfer these ideas out of the game, but also give them accurate representations of long-term consequence for the decisions they make. So it's not as simple as I chose the right answer in a multiple choice test. It really needs to come down to I persuaded this person to take an action, and because they listened to my advice or didn't listen to my advice, there's a particular outcome associated with it. So the closest analog I think any of us have come up with for this is something like a combination of Persona and Telltale games, Fallout or Skyrim, anything where choices matter. But yeah, to Colter's point, Telltale games only give you the illusion of choice, that you make these decisions that aren't really yours to make. And if you play the game more than once, you realize that those decisions are entirely artificial. Whereas in this experience, we really tried to focus on creating a branching narrative that diverges and then reconverges based on the choices you make, which, as you'll find, is quite challenging to do. And so I'm going to pass this back over to Colter and the others so they can talk a bit more about that part of it.
So we'll, talking about that actually, Devin, I'd love to go over to you a little bit, talk about how did you set up the system for getting it to actually diverge and then reconverge?
Yeah, first of all, I want to touch on something Steve said, which is the deteriorating state of civil discourse. Something I've said to Colter is that it's so optimistic and refreshing to play a game where you can meet people, very different views with, and come to play the game as well as you can with everything. Really like healing for me. Anyway, uh, the divergent systems on the smallest level within the dialogue. Most of these discussions take place within the context of fairly uniform events called narrative events. You listen to this person's problem, they explain their problem to you, don't explicitly name a learning theory or anything like that. You understand their perspective, demonstrate to them that you understand their perspective. And if you can do that successfully, you will then get to continue anyway, but they don't come to be reflected. Characters and the rest of the game, they're standing in.
Matt, do you want to comment on the responses, the emote responses you get from individual outcomes? So for instance, how the facial expressions are designed to change based on your choices?
So, I can't really take credit for coming up with all of the brilliant and very saddening facial expressions that the characters make when you say the correct or incorrect thing to them. But it was definitely very fun to explore all of their personalities and think about how they might reflect their feelings towards what you're saying to them, depending on what their role is on EOS-503, or the people who they work with, or what faction they're a part of.
So it looks like on some of these that some of the characters are based on team members, at least visually. And I'm sort of curious for the characters, like, is that, are you intentionally putting people visually in there? And then in terms of like their personalities and their responses, are those also in any way based on people, or like how you came up with the personas?
That's a great question. So, as far as I can remember, the only person who is in EOS is Steve.
That was not my choice, by the way.
Yes.
I want to be clear about that.
And that was less of an intentional design decision. Saying that there was a character named Stephen. Creating it without anyone's consent. That's not for forgiveness.
It's okay, she did a really good job.
I can talk a little bit about the design.
Yeah.
No, that's what I was gonna do.
Yeah, okay.
So, the other thing I'll add is, if you see the, if you want to scroll
I'll
over.
scroll ahead to-
There. So we have an entire character creator in the game that we designed, so that people could make characters that seem, at least to the extent that we currently have, and Matt is continuing to add and expand that to be more like incredibly looking new hairstyles, new different ways of dressing. We want to add two-tone clothes, so it's not all like monotone designs. But we wanted people to be able to, especially because our target audience for this are educators who might have no game experience whatsoever. We wanted them to be able to potentially connect with the character that they're going to be playing as in this world. Because as they're going around and forming these relationships with people, if they want to create a character that's not at all like them, go for it, more power to them. If they want to create a character that is similar to them, and so that they can feel a more empathic connection potentially to a character that they identify with closely, we wanted them to be able to have that option as well. And so the character that you see here is Steve without the ears. It was in Steve's own playthrough, but outside of that, all of the NPCs I randomly generated. So I randomly generated using random name generators for multiple different cultures across the planet. Was just like, cool, and then let me randomly assign you roles as well. And so I randomly assigned roles to people, and the current state of the world is based on that. And actually, I used your system for world building to design the 3 different main communities that people explore. I used the system for each one independently to create 3 entire different ecosystems that have different values. One of them is very worker. They're called the workers, the seekers, and the people. Yeah, want to go here. So they have different actual philosophies of education that are the underpinnings for each of those communities. So for the workers, they value education for career training, right? And the problems that exist within that community are the unions that are the different trade groups. And so the main conflict that you work on resolving there are getting the unions to actually talk to the administration. And there is currently a dispute, and so the janitors aren't working. Neither are the repair people. And so you need to solve these to be able to work towards overarching goals. For the people, it's education for democracy, right? Educating so that people can engage in a democratic society and actually be fully functioning and informed members of that society. And so they have an authoritarian queue that you need to resolve as you go through their different specific section. And then the seekers are education for self-actualization. And their issue is, what if you only did art and didn't care about economy ever? How does that work for continuing to have goods to make art, though? And so you have to find that balance between within a society that there is some capitalism. You still need to be able to engage with that, but how do you engage with that in ways that are meaningful and good and maybe not as detrimental to the extent possible within that kind of system, right? And so you have to kind of coordinate and understand each of these different issues that are going on within these communities, because ultimately in Act 1, the issue is that these 3 governors that you see don't want to work together, and you need to get them to work together again. That's why you're there. And specifically, EOS is the ship, and Commune 503 is the one that you're engaging with. So yeah, and then we have one more governor that is on the right, actually, if you want to go back to that slide, which is Hanmin Su. And Hanmin Su is the neutral faction. What was originally going to be the capital at the center of Commune 503 was abandoned because the governors couldn't work together. And so Hanmin Su is left for the neutral faction, the people that didn't fit into any of the other 3 societies, and is kind of leading governing them. And Hanmin Su's arc gets explored more in Act 2. I will say that we're still currently in development on and working on. But the kind of main act, as you can see here in Act 2, you're working as an education advisor, and specifically you're trying to solve problems of tech integration in that phase. You're working, as we were talking about the technology coordinator standards, you're really working to try and we split it, I'll put it this way. We split each of those decisions into 2. There is the decision about which different of the groups are you going to support, and then, yeah, if you want to scroll, go, yeah. And then how well are you actually meeting the standard? So if you're thinking about integrating technology in some meaningful way, there are multiple different ways that you could incorporate technology that could be beneficial within any given kind of problem. Say that you're having problems with equitable use of digital learning tools, right, for point A, point B, right? So there are a lot of different ways that you can go about that. The different factions are each going to value different ways of approaching that situation. How well you do that, then, is what we're going to be using to assess how proficient the individual student playing it is at actualizing that standard. And so it allows us to examine not just how are they balancing the various different factions and the influence that they have with them, but also, given that, how well are they actually meeting the goals for trying to use the learning technology in some meaningful way for the community?
Yeah. I have one quick thing about ISTE. So again, we focused on the ISTE standards for technology coaches and educators. And the reason why I pull up the Change Agent 1 4.1 is because this is arguably the most difficult to achieve of all of the ISTE standards, primarily because it focuses on visionary leadership. And as we think through, as a program that actually certifies people who gets diplomas, that you go out into the world and you do this job, we needed to ensure that we were capturing all of the ISTE standards. And there aren't easy ways to teach or assess visionary leadership, especially in a richly authentic way. Usually it's a very impoverished approach where you might have somebody write an essay, or they might describe something that they did on a video with respect to student teaching, right? So one of the things we wanted to do is get as close as possible to offering a virtual practicum for these students within the institution. so that they could practice some of these skills in a fail-safe environment. And this actually diverges quite a bit from some of the experiences I had working with other institutions building educational games where there was a desire for continuous pro-social engagement with everyone in the universe. So imagine, I'm not going to name names or projects, but imagine a project where you're having a branching dialogue and all four of the options you're given are identical to one another. So they may be superficially a little bit different than one another. The wording may be a little bit different, but ultimately they are the same thing. And it would be, yes, I really want to work with you, or oh boy, sounds fun, or that sounds like an enjoyable experience. And no matter which one you choose, it's always going to have exactly the same output. We actually wanted to focus on allowing people to intentionally inflame their relationships with others on the space station in an effort to see what would happen as a consequence. So in the same way that I might play Fallout in two very different capacities. I might do one as trying to get the ultimate moral goodness. I might do one as the ultimate moral evil and try to see how the outcomes in that game change. We wanted to reflect the same thing here and be able to say, not every interaction you have is going to go positively. That's okay. You may want to experiment with and see what happens if you intentionally go that pathway. I think back to a Games Learning and Society conference presentation I attended about 10 or 11 years ago now, and it focused on SimCity. And the example that they gave, I think it's an MIT project. They were using SimCity EDU. They had asked all the players, all the students who were participating in the study, to reduce the level of pollution in the city below some threshold, whatever that was. And when they described the data, they only described the students who actually reduced the pollution, not those who did other things. And some of the data they considered outlier was actually students who purposely increased the level of pollution in the city, which to me at least demonstrated that those students understood the system. They understood how the system operated. They just chose to play in a way that diverged from what the designer's intent was. And that doesn't invalidate that data or suggest that they aren't learning. It just suggests that they aren't being assessed on the thing that they actually learned. And so when we talk about this one-to-one ratio, this is what we're coming back to, is giving people the agency to make choices or exert agency within the space of the game such that we can still assess or see that they are making these decisions in particular ways, especially across multiple playthroughs, and not gets hung up on, are they doing it right? It's a question of, are they expressing growth? Are they expressing change? And then interrogating qualitatively, what is it about their experience that's changing from one point to another?
So just a note on that experiential change that happens throughout gameplay. I think it's very important to mention that throughout the entire time that you're playing this, based on what you do and the people that you talk to and the successes or failures that you have, the environment itself is evolving. If you do not convince the janitors to work and clean, things will be dirty. They have regions that are dirty. The subway, much like New York's, is very dirty until you convince them to go and help. And the character that's based off of Steve is sitting in a park, which doesn't get any use in the workers' mold, where their ideology is that everything should exist for a purpose of working and production. A park is useless, but if you convince, what was it, the standard 5-minute break every day, for the productivity increases, and that park flourishes. And I would also like to shout out Megan Doherty, who could not make it today, who I worked very, very closely with for the environment design and actually visualizing these changes over time. And in addition to the people actually changing their attitude and to whether or not you succeed or fail at the end, the environment over time will change and the world will change, and the impact that you have on it is measurable, both by the students or player or the assessment. And I think that's a huge part of this game that really sets it apart from other edutainment experiences, is that you are playing an RPG in the end. You're interacting with this environment, this world, and these people, much like you would in, I suppose, a more conventional RPG. So I thought that was very important. Yeah.
Yeah, so those like environmental changes, features in the game, together in the branching structure that the branches, but the branches don't have ends. There's no game over screen. If everyone, the space station blows up. it's, like we decided early on that it was more meaningful as a learning experience, as a role-playing experience, as an embodiment experience, to see the effects of your action without like diverging from the main experience. So that we could have a learning track and learning objective, stick to them, while at the same time your actions in a way that is less gamified and telltale and more organic in people's attitudes.
Just to touch on that, gamification of things, I think that one of the biggest struggles that we have faced throughout the entire time of making this is that there are very specific educational goals, while there are also very specific design goals. And crossing that bridge has been a lot of creation of things, which then from this half of the room, which then goes to this half of the room, and they say, okay, these are great, but here's what we need to change in order to satisfy our goals, which goes back to this half of the room. And that's not a bad thing. That's just how that works. It's critique and it's process of iteration and refining it, but it is a really in-depth process. And we have faced design challenges that we previously would not have even thought of just by doing this process. And yeah, highlighting that is, oh, sorry, highlighting that is, I think it's very important in this process for sure. Yeah.
So one other thing that I probably want to touch on in talking about all the production narratives is that we have 2 acts for the game. And Act 1, if you decide to play it together with Act 2, informs Act 2. So in Act 1, you make a lot of decisions about how you engage with individuals within the environment and communities, as well as how you engage with some of the like we call them like sub bosses, right? Some of the higher power, higher authority figures. Those all change the influence that you have going into Act 2 with the various factions. That influence is then used so that you get different end states to the game, as well as being able to choose different, have different choices about who you want to support while you're making your decisions in Act 2 about technology integration. So we wanted to have each could be played independently, and we have a way to play Act 2 without having played Act 1, and just like here is the set standard for if you're just going through Act 2. But if you just go through Act 1 into Act 2, you're going to have a different starting state depending upon your own actions. And as well as directly informs the character conclusions. We wanted to make sure that these branching, like Devin was saying, that there's no like direct like, oh, this is all funneled to a game over speed. Instead, it's all responsive. So we have various character endings that are both informed by the individual character and where they ended up, as well as the community ending. So depending upon your involvement and interaction and engagement with the community, you have differences in whether or not the language is, oh, hey, you were able to help me solve my individual problem. As well, were you able to help my community be in a better state than it was at the beginning of all of it? And so by having all of that, it enables not only the potential for more replayability, for seeing how these various things diverge and change, but also enables people to actually see, like we were saying, the consequences of your actions. To understand that because I wasn't able to help this person, their future is a little bit different. And that doesn't mean that it's necessarily always bad, right? Sometimes you fail and that's okay, and even good potentially, but it allows them at least to see that every choice that we make has some impact on those runs, especially when you're having a conversation with someone about a problem that they're having.
So one thing for me that makes this experience really colorful and really interesting, we had a very long discussion about whether or not in Act 2, if you just started from Act 2, if you made a character, and whether you wanted to embody yourself in that world, or whether we wanted to kind of take the player away and like look at that world. And eventually, I believe we settled on the fact that you can if you want to, which is what we found was like the best idea, because you're not really, in this case, you're not really building a city in SimCity, and you're not really designing a theme park in Roller Coaster Tycoon 2. You're not trying to satisfy your citizens or your guests. You're trying to interact with the world, and slowly over time, you are becoming part of that world as your changes are being shown in real time. And that was just a quick note on what to basically tie in one of these iterative problems that we really have had to churn out from the design perspective, as well as the learning objectives that we had. That was something that, if we didn't have the character creator, personally, I feel that we would not have satisfied that embodiment that the player needs to have in a scenario like this, and to keep it interesting and fresh. Because you're never tackling problems the same way in this game. You're always critically thinking about each interaction that you have and what consequences it could potentially have later on.
Or non-critically, right? But that's a valid choice. I think we would like players to critically be making decisions, but like we were talking about with assessment, if players are non-critically making choices, that's part of the analysis that we're going to run. We're going to be looking at dwell time. How long are they taking to make their decision? Right. So this is just a sample of some of the data that we started to collect. But we look at, for each independent line throughout the process that a character is going through, we're looking at what's on screen, how long are they letting it dwell on screen, and as well being able to look at pathway trajectories for each player and be able to actually see that growth over time, right? Or a lack of growth over time, or growth for specific subdomains over time, right? So being able to understand very deeply through the data what is being changed, right? What is changing? How fast is it changing? Are they actually going back and looking at the conversation history? Are they going to look back at what people have said before to help inform how they're going to be making choices? Or are they just button mashing through as fast as they can and then just clicking the first decision that they want in the middle because they're like a game tester and just trying to see if there are bugs? So being able to understand through the actual data analysis of the games, not only, oh, here are the decisions they made, how many right, quote unquote, right choices did they make in terms of helping people like successfully resolve their problems, but also what pathways and trajectories.
Yeah, this was something that I had a question about, and I'm glad that you got to it, because I was thinking about if I assigned this in a class, you know, and you mentioned like maybe somebody wants to explore with wrong choices and see what happens, then as an instructor, the only way that I can assess their learning is a reflective essay, right? So my assessment would happen outside the game, and I'm curious if that's sort of an intentional choice, if there was ever a desire to try to handle assessment inside the game.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question. It was actually on my mind as Colter was talking about the lag time and looking at how long is somebody standing in XY position in the map. So I like to think about this as being necessary but insufficient to do that kind of assessment. So it's not to say that you could implement this in a classroom and an hour later or 2 hours later, your students are done. Now you have this output data like a Scantron sheet that you just check off and yeah, you did it, you did it. That actually really has worried me through this process because we couldn't offer infinite choices when you respond to something. There's no way, no practical way to be able to create a text input so that people could write their own custom response to all of these characters and get some kind of meaningful output. I mean, you could probably fabricate something with AI, but it wouldn't be terribly helpful. And because we align this with the curriculum of the ed tech program, what we're really looking for is a correlation between performance on other measures with performance in the game. So we would never look at this data and say, this person gets it, this person doesn't. But rather look at the track record as measured through a long-form portfolio throughout the year that these students are in the program, and then looking at how did they play early in the program, how did they play at the end of the program. And we've actually done this research, not with this specific game, but with other card games and board games we've developed for ed tech purposes. So we have one game called Influence that's entirely based on trying to satisfy multiple stakeholders and keep them in check with one another without losing influence from one of them and then getting fired. We have another game called Kartamen, which is a debate and rhetoric game in which we had teachers sit down and basically get 2 minutes per person to pick a card from their hand and defend that as being the response to a given controversy. So for instance, the controversy might be more important to administrators. And one teacher ends up playing a card that says, I think direct instruction is more important to administrators. And then somebody else plays a card that says, I think that setting boundaries for behavioral reinforcement are going to be more important to administrators. And within that 2 minutes, we're actually not looking at the argumentation of the people who make those arguments. We're instead looking at the argumentation of the judges who are watching this process. Because what we found is that folks who are watching and have to make a decision about who wins in that debate ultimately have to externalize their thinking to their teammates. And by looking at that externalization of information, we can look for changes over the course of the 1 year program that does positively correlate with performance in the portfolio. So it's not to say that playing this game is indicative of you're at tech or you don't. It's more so that we're able to look at this as one additional measure of assessment that is a playful assessment and ultimately can be played in multiple different ways by different people. And because this is still in the iterative design stages and we haven't fully implemented it to collect this data, what we're really looking for is, does it work? Does it work the same way that card common and influence do? Is there a significant effect in how the students end up perceiving and acting on different kinds of tech-based or ISTE standard-based decision making? And because the program is designed to teach tech coordinators, that's the ballgame. Like, you need to be able to show accreditors or show graduating students or incoming students or the administration within the university that you're able to put your money where your mouth is with respect to doing the teaching that needs to be done to make new tech coordinators. This is one way we can do that. And so, again, like, I would never look at this as the test to see if you passed being a good ed tech student. Instead, it's an opportunity for us to interrogate how and why are different kinds of students engaging in different ways, and then use it as a metric to go back to them and ask for qualitative feedback about how they participated in this and why. Sorry, trying to hear your hand.
Yeah, I mean, my questions are also about, like, you can learn from a game, and what you learn is how to play the game without being able to transfer it to the real world. So if I learn how to play Darkest Dungeon, I don't actually know how to get 3 people into a dungeon, right? I mean, I wish I did. But the thing that this is something I was thinking about talking about this morning too on the panel with the humanities, is one of the things that the humanities is terrible at are these longevity studies. Like, we never ask graduates, how many times in the last decade since your graduation did you remember something from a history class or a literature class that in that moment inspired you and made life worth living, right? We don't do that. We ask how many people got jobs directly out in their major. Those are the metrics by which we are being measured by, in which the humanities are always getting steamrolled by. But you kind of answered the question already, but I was wondering whether there's any way to institute any sort of like longevity. Like, now you're a tech ed or ed tech student, and then you go out into the world, and then 3 years later, we're going to say, do you remember that game that you played? Is there anything there that resonated with you that, textbook assignments didn't?
That's a great question too. And that's actually one of the alternate goals of this project, is not just to teach pre and in-service teachers. We actually made this public and free and available in a browser that can be played on virtually any device. Hopefully it's working currently. Doesn't work so well on mobile right now. We have to figure out some things with that. But one of the goals with this was to help administrators use this as professional development to do that kind of work, because we can't go and measure all of those people. And even the people who graduate from our program, we lose them over time. Like, they change careers, they do something else with their life, they move away. There are all these reasons why longitudinal research is obviously really difficult. But one thing that we do have is they are captured in this program for 1 year. Like, we can actually do this longitudinal, watch their growth or development over that time and be able to see whether or not that correlates with the other experiences that they're having. And there's some recently published research, I can't remember where I got this, but it was a study that looked at teacher effectiveness over time, or teacher mastery over time. And it turns out teachers are really effective right when they come out of school, but after 5 or 10 years, their effectiveness deteriorates pretty rapidly. Like, they don't stay as competent as they were. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I mean, part of it is just time away from school, so you're not getting new information regularly. Part of it is cynicism or unwillingness to go out and do new things because you found a good pattern to go through. The only thing that seems to affect that is whether somebody goes back and tries to go back to school or does something that re-engages them through professional development and really pushes them to go back up that slope and become proficient again, or to sustain. So that if you're out of school for 5 years, but you go back and get a master's degree in ed tech or something, you're able to sustain that same level of mastery over time instead of having it deteriorate. So we see this as yet another tool in the toolbox to be able to do some of that harder long-term work. And that's one of the reasons why I'm really interested in sharing this with administrators and with other education programs, to basically say, look, we made this, it's free. You don't have to sign up for anything. There's no registration. We're not collecting your data unless we actually explicitly ask you for it. So that's something we actually didn't talk about earlier with the data files there, but we don't collect data from everyone. We're only assigning experimental numbers or anonymized numbers to the people that we know are going to be in the program. everybody else can just access this without an ID or without any need to provide data because we're not Facebook. Like our job is not to monetize this. And it's much more effective to make something that's freely available and widely accessible to as many people as possible if your goals have to do with public scholarship and improving the quality of education writ large for everybody. So these are a lot of things that I think about as a researcher. And sorry, you had a question, Alan.
I was just kind of linked to that with learning to play the game, not learning from the game. As also like one element of that is in a lot of choice-based games, it's like, oh, I didn't want to make that choice, or oh, I don't like this outcome. I'm going to load the save. It does. I'm just curious if the tracking does it take account of that, or if it doesn't take account of that, if there's something just to represent
So
that.
it would. It would 100% take it on. We actually also just implemented the save and load system in the game recently, but you can't do it mid-conversation.
Yeah.
Because we didn't want people to literally quick save right before they make a choice, quick load, and then make a different choice. But it would account for that because part of what we track is both the in-game time as well as real-world time, so that we're able to see how those might differ as people are saving and loading. Another thing I wanted to touch on, which that actually reminded me of, is we were talking kind of more largely about how this is used as an assessment measure and comparing to various other real-world program assessments that we're using. So one of them is the portfolio, and the other is for the learning theory part of Act 1, is they currently do kind of a paper essentially on, let's pick one learning theory, and I'm going to talk about that extensively. So we're also going to compare it to that assessment and see, so versus a game which has 7 different learning theories in it, what is the proficiency in talking about just this one? And are we seeing a pattern that they're able to succeed well in that specific learning theory, but maybe not the others? Or do we see a more robust, that generally the more they're informed about learning theory, they're better able to answer or have a better trajectory of growth over time? And so my dissertation for the different parts of it is, the first part is assessing it compared to the learning theory assessment. The second part is assessing it compared to the portfolio. And the plan for the third part is assessing over time when they play it in the first, in 6 months into their cohort and then at the very end of it. So those are some of the last things. Oh, and the last thing, I guess, because I see that we're running low on time, is you can check out the game at EOS-503.com. Plug our free game that we get nothing from other than people trying it. But yeah, so that's most of it. Anything else?
I'd also like to quickly shout out 2 other members who couldn't be here. Wesley McFadden, who's doing a lot of playtesting, and then a very important member of the team, Clara O'Hara, who actually programmed and did all of the data collection for this game. It is because of her that we are able to actually go through this process.
The next dissertation.
And unfortunately, she couldn't be. Yep.
Thank you very much.
This is just a screen showing all of the other people who assisted. And as I said, this evolved over the last decade or so. So what you see in 2014 was the project I worked on for my dissertation, and now it has iterated into multiple different versions, including an RPG Maker version that was called Anti-Fight Clash of Reason. That title didn't stick for obvious reasons. But certainly we do want you to play. We'd love your feedback. You're welcome to share this with other people. We're actually treating this conference as sort of our early access launch of the game. So I'm going to be promoting on social media and stuff too. And if you go to the EdTech website for UConn, it's edtech.education.uconn.edu. There is a project drop-down page that is about this, that has another talk I recently gave about the project to teachers and administrators, as well as several of these slides that are updated to reflect where the project is at and what its goals were. So again, thank you all for coming.